Zoom, zoom, Rich Howells. How are you, buddy?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. We just got done saying Richard has never been interviewed before. Well,
Very
normally,
rarely.
yes, you're normally the interviewee or interviewer on an EPA scene, which is huge.
Oh, thank you. We've I've worked very hard over the last 5 years to build it up into what it is.
Well, that's the thing. I remember you were gracious enough to come in and do a quick little blurb about the show I was directing up a handing in Spokane at the time when you came to the theater, and you did a nice little write-up for us, and that was right around the beginning of your venture with NEPA scene, and then since then, watching it grow, it's undeniably it's only getting better. Put it that way. It's not getting worse. So that's a good thing. But we went to high school together
Well,
too.
yeah, we did. I loved Behanding in Spokane, by the way. I actually got to see it on its little Broadway run when they had Sam Rockwell and Christopher Walken in it. Oh, and honestly, I had just as much fun at your production. It was really great.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember you saying that you caught the original run that actually tanked on Broadway. That's why I was fearful of doing it. It tanked on Broadway. I'm not sure why. The material itself is a little weird, but when I read the script, I laughed my ass off. I'm thinking, like, this is great. So I don't know exactly
Yeah.
what happened on Broadway, but those are critics' reviews, not patrons' reviews. So take that for whatever the fuck it's worth. But any
Sure.
PA scene, let us know about it. So what would you be considered? Like creator, co-founder, executive, director?
I call myself the founder and editor because I started it about 5 years ago. It'll be 6 years in September. And I was a blogger originally, and I did that for from high school into college. And then out of college, it took me a little while to find a job in the newspaper industry because, even at that point, it was starting to wane. But then I was lucky enough to become a staff writer and then an editor in a couple of local newspapers. And so I did that for about 5 years, and then I got laid off. So
And you did those things, and I don't want to speak for you, but I can imagine you did those things begrudgingly.
At first, definitely at first, because I originally wanted to be a creative writer. But it's very hard to make a living doing that. So obviously you have to, get there somehow. So I figured I'll start in newspapers and then I'll move into something else.
Right.
But then I found that I really liked interviewing people and I really liked telling real stories as opposed to having to make up stories. It's much easier to do that, but it's also, I just found it more interesting.
Well, it harkens back to the truth is stranger than fiction. You find much more depth and richness in people's real life stories as opposed to what you could possibly fathom because you're limited by your own experiences. And how could you possibly think outside the box if you're not somebody else with different experiences? So yeah, interviewing people, I mean, opens up a whole new world that just doesn't exist inside your own head because it's your head.
Right. And I really particularly enjoyed doing the arts and entertainment stories. So I worked for a local weekly for a little while that was arts and entertainment related. That's kind of on its way out now.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of gave, I didn't think I was going to get that job at the time because I had to transition from one to another. And there was an interview process. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm ever going to get this. So I actually, I bought the NEPA scene domain name and reserved all of the social media stuff maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And it just sat there. Right. And I ended up getting the job. So I did that. And I really enjoyed it up until, like a lot of newspapers, it got taken over by yet another company and another company. And it just kept
your milkshake. I drink it up.
And I was working with very much people like that, very greedy people. and a lot of people who just honestly were not fit for the jobs that they were given. They were given it
Isn't
based
that the
on
way it always goes?
connections.
Isn't that the way it always goes? The people that have
Yeah.
the talent, ability, and wantingness never get the jobs. It's the schmucks that don't have the talent. They just happen to have the door, the back door to walk into. Well, the front door to walk into, as a matter of fact. So that's a damn shame. But I want to make a point, though. You said you put this little nugget. You bought the domain name several years before you actually made it a thing. So that says to me, regardless of whatever job you were going for, something in your mind subconsciously knew that ultimately NEPA scene and your adventure with that was going to be the thing.
Yeah, I definitely knew for a long time that I wanted to run my own publication my own way. And I knew that the only way I could do that cost effectively was to do a digital only publication. And as much as I enjoy print, I like print. I'm a comic book collector. I love having print in my hand, but it's
That's a
not
different kind
practical.
of print. That's a different kind of print. Now that has artistic value to it. When you're talking about other things, I mean, what you're talking about as far as introducing the local masses to the art scene, interviewing people, things like that on paper form is just a waste of trees, in my opinion. Just do it this way. Now, an artistic rendering of, a graphic novel, that's well worth its weight in pulp. Save the trees. You know what I mean? Reserve them for things that are, like you said, worth having, holding, because I'm also that type of guy. But I did want to say thank you to, I mean, you had me on your podcast several times. I've been on NEPA scene. I promoted Van Life, a show that I co-wrote, directed, produced, and starred in with Kim Elef. And the film with Lindsay Brace, The Road Less Traveled, you were kind enough. Oh, well, we got to have some beer that time. That was great. What's your buddy's name
Yeah,
that does it with you? I forget his name.
John Popko.
John
So
Popko.
So yeah, we and funny you mentioned that, and we were talking about newspapers and stuff. He can't do the show with me anymore because he works for one of the local newspapers, and now they see my publication as competition to them.
Wow. Well,
So
good for
they
you.
told him essentially that he had to stop
It's
doing
a
it.
conflict of
So
interest.
yeah, so it sucks because I love doing it with him, um, but
It's
I've
awesome
continued
because
doing
you're
the show
direct
my own way.
competition.
Yeah, it feels very good. The papers that I used to work for immediately felt threatened when I launched NEPA Scene and tried to copy my content, rip off my content,
Of course.
smack talk me every which way, and obviously I won out on
You
that because
you
those
weathered
guys
the
are bringing it
storm,
to town now.
motherfucker. You weathered that storm because that is, of
Yeah.
course, the tactic of your competition is to try to undermine you. Now, John, was he a part of that? Were you able to speak to him personally while that was going on and
No,
be like, "Are you doing this to me, motherfucker?"
so there's two big newspapers in the area, and the one I used to work for is where me and John originally met. We used to work for the same paper, and then he went to work for the competition because that paper was dying off, and then I got laid off maybe a few months later. So
Yep.
so
Yep.
he's working for the other paper now, and it's weird because it depends on who you talk to there. Some people are like, oh yeah, Rich, he's great, whatever he's doing there, that's wonderful, it's its own thing. And then other people at the company feel threatened by a guy doing what they're doing on a much smaller budget, but with bigger results. I mean, they just launched their own
People
arts and
hate that,
entertainment
don't they?
website.
They're like, "Oh, look at this son of a bitch doing it on a shoestring," and we're like, we're blowing people at the state level for funding or whatever, however the case may go. But Rich, just to segue out of this as clunkily as possible, you're the fucking man. And if you ever
Thank
need
you, man.
someone to fill John's seat as a fucking as a bouncer board, as a sounding board or whatever, call me up, sucker, because I love you. I always have since high school. But this is the 101 Must See Movie Club. What
Yeah.
I'm interested in you right now is what you've come up with film-wise.
So funny enough, a lot of people who maybe know me from the NEPA Scene podcast or just see me in person, I'm usually wearing a Marvel or Star Wars t-shirt. So I think everybody would assume that I'm going to pick Star Wars and Marvel movies, and none of them are on my list.
I can understand that. Well, those movies are for fun, escape. They're not something that move you. They're not something that instills something everlasting in you. They just spark that joy that you already have for graphic novels and things like that. But I can totally understand how they may not end up on your top 5 of movies that mean something to you personally.
Yeah, yeah. I was definitely a film buff for a long time. I was a manager at a Blockbuster for a little while when that was still around.
Kevin
Before
Joyce, I
I
had
got my
Kevin Joyce
newspaper
on. He
job.
was a Blockbuster employee.
Yeah, I saw that. So he knows how it is. You know, you watch so many movies based on that because you constantly get asked for recommendations. And so I felt bad just making stuff up. So I really started buckling down and like watching all the classics and watching all the cult classics, the things that people tell you to watch that you never really get around to. I just sat down and really for a few years, that's all I did was watch movies all the
I
time.
had a period like that, and I do need another length of time like that to catch up even more. So I totally understand. And with that being said, I'm sure you got a couple gems in there that found their way to
Yeah.
you.
So I grabbed I have a huge DVD collection downstairs, so I grabbed a bunch of those. My honorable mention, I guess, will be Taxi Driver.
I like that as an honorable mention because, like I said, probably the only Martin Scorsese film I would allow on this list was Casino that Sam Falbo brought up, just because it's a little bit outside of his the good old one. So Taxi Driver is a great honorable mention because it's fantastic. It's just it's a little too well loved and liked already, but it's
Yeah,
great.
that's how I felt. So my number one, I guess I'll start number one
Do you want to do that now? Here, people have been doing it differently. Do you want to start from the bottom up, or do you want to work your way from your favorite down?
yeah, my I'll definitely say my top favorite of all time is Clockwork Orange.
It's
And
heavy. That says a lot about you, Richard.
it was the first movie that I saw that made me understand that movies could be art. Up until that point, I was a young teenager at that point, and all I had seen was your typical blockbuster fare. So seeing that at that age just blew my mind.
And it
I
was a good
couldn't
point,
even.
right? Because you're watching something so surreal, so sadistic, that it finally probably does click in your head that, oh, this is purposeful, this is deliberate. And then it's like, why? Why are they doing it deliberately? And then you extrapolate upon that, and then before you know it, you're making connections in your head, and you realize, film is art.
Yeah, for sure. And I never saw anything like that. And around the same time, I also saw The Shining, so I became a Kubrick fan right away. The Shining was also probably the first scary movie that I had seen. I
Unsettling,
wasn't.
very. It's
Yeah,
unsettling,
yeah,
yeah.
it's disturbing. Yeah, and it was like one of those like I'm watching it real late at night. I was staying over my grandmother's house. Me and my cousin used to stay over my grandma's house all the time, and she would just she was the cool grandma. So she
Right.
let us do whatever we wanted, watch whatever we wanted, that sort of thing. So we would go to the video
You took
store, rent
advantage
these
of
movies.
grandma's lack of knowledge. That's what you did.
Funny enough though, she was so cool. She knew what we were getting into. Like she had seen
Okay.
The Shining before. She knew who Stanley Kubrick was.
Oh, okay. All
So
right.
I wasn't even pulling one over on her.
Yeah.
She was actually just like, yeah, you know what, you're old enough, you're good,
Yeah, because that
and
one time
so.
we did acid in front of my grandmother without her knowing. I don't recommend it because we couldn't have been out of that house quicker. And she's looking at us like, what the fuck is wrong? We're like, "Bing!" Yeah, grandma wasn't that cool, but my grandma was that cool. Was cool enough. So yeah, because we used to have sleepover nights all the time at my grandmother's, and that's where I've seen a lot of my favorite movies, and that's why they are some of my favorite movies, because they make me think of being at my grandmother's, that wonderful time when you're a kid and love staying over and doing that shit with them. adds to the value of those movies altogether. But Stanley Kubrick in general is another one where any one of his, for the most part, all of them, even Eyes Wide Shut, I would argue, because I watched it several times and found more and more things to appreciate about it every time. But go ahead, continue on.
For sure. So yeah, that movie always meant a lot to me. It was disturbing. It was weird. It was different. We watched it multiple times that weekend to really kind of get a grasp on it. So
did you hook your eyes open that weekend too, just to really instill those images?
Yeah, it felt like it,
Mm-hmm.
you know. It was quite the experience. So
And
it's always stuck with me.
It's
It's so
beautifully
beautiful.
shot. Like all the and it's, what year was that? Was that so like the 60s, early 70s, or like
Yeah,
70s?
early 70s, I believe.
Yeah, they were still playing around with
71, it says.
yeah, it's almost an art house film in the way that it plays around with its imagery. It's clownery. It's everything is very distinct in that movie, and I think it goes to speak to the detail that Stanley Kubrick obsessed over, and to the point where the people that worked with and around him hated him, but could not deny the translation to screen that it was worth every second of it. But Clockwork Orange is, based on the book too, which was a sense. I think all of his works were adaptations.
Yeah, I think pretty much all of them were. And his, it's funny because everybody knows the story of Stephen King hated The Shining, but then he got the opportunity to do his own version. And it was awful. It was the worst thing I've ever seen. It was so bad.
Stephen King hated The Shining because Stanley Kubrick took it and made it better. I will argue that.
Yes.
I read the book. I know what was left out. Then I saw what Stephen King thought should have been the result of his book, and it was buffoonery. That's because
Right.
Stephen King is not a visual artist. He is he's a literary artist. And that's totally different. You might think they're the same because he's creating a visual world, but that's only based on the reader's perspective. Most of his books cannot translate to film, and every time someone has tried it, they have to take the supernatural or surreal out in order for it to work. His best adaptations are always the short stories, like Stand By Me, which was The Body, Shawshank Redemption, which was one of his short stories. Those are always the best translated because they're compact. There isn't a lot of stuff in the middle that it's not so esoteric. So
Right.
Stephen King hated The Shining because it outdid his book. And I don't think he'll ever admit that, but
Right.
he hated it for that reason. But The Shining is a fucking masterpiece.
So my next one on my list is you and Bobby Keller mentioned this, Night of the Living Dead.
Brilliant.
I definitely love Dawn of the Dead, and I think most people would pick that one, but I always loved.
Well,
Night
that's
of
the
Living
one
Dead.
that Bobby picked. Bobby picked Dawn of the Dead, and then I brought up Night of the Living Dead because of the copyright issues. We talked about Night of the Living Dead because of the political satire and things like that. We touched on it, but he picked Dawn of the Dead. That was his pick out of the Romero.
Yeah, I didn't, and I watched all the other episodes, so I definitely didn't want to pick something else. But it just so happened that the movies I picked before I watched them all are all ones that haven't been mentioned yet, unless maybe an episode like I think you have Connor on coming up. I don't know what he picked, so maybe there's some.
I do, and put it this
but
way, I don't think any worlds will collide. I've said that many times. It's so weird what you think you're going to get from people, and everything is so far apart. Think of how many fucking movies there are in the world. You know what I'm saying?
Right. True.
But you go ahead. Night of the Living Dead. Why, baby? Why?
Well, of course, it's the start of the zombie genre, and I do enjoy zombie movies, but the ending is incredibly impactful, and I love that it was done on such a small budget, and it was a passion project, and it's one of the few of those types of movies that still holds up many years later. That the effects still look good. The acting is still great. It's just a solid movie overall, especially for a first-time filmmaker who
And from that
essentially
point on, he changed. Well, actually, he didn't change. He created the zombie. That is,
I mean, it establishes the rules,
right.
like
Exactly.
the sacred rules that you think of when you think of every zombie movie ever. You granted, yeah, maybe later they added the running thing and stuff like that, but I always prefer the shambling zombies. I always thought that was more of a realistic threat. If they could run, we'd all be dead in days. Like that would be the end of it. There's no way you're surviving that.
Yeah, and there has to be
if they have superhuman strength and they're able to run around like maniacs. Like there's some of those ones are good. 28 Days Later is fun, but there's something about the original Zombie and the way it's done. And he was able to take, with Night, Dawn, and Day, each one has different messages, but they all fit together very well. Even though they're shot in different eras, they represent different ideas, but there's common threads among all of them. And
well, that's what we
started with Night of the Living Dead.
Right. So after he accidentally got his political message with Night of the Living Dead and the brilliant black actor who ended up playing the part, he saw that and took that opportunity through the rest of his films to weave in signs of the times, things like that, which is the responsibility of an artist, a director, a filmmaker, because it's always a reflection of the time at that time, then and there, So yeah, he did a great job at that, and all of his films. I'm sorry if you're getting wires. Well, all of his films, for that reason, whether or not they're about zombies eating people and it's gratuitous gore and whatnot, they mean something. They absolutely mean something beyond the things that other people might find to be like, oh God, that's just So he has a nice little collection of reflections of his generation, But Night of the Living Dead.
For sure, yeah. And each one was shot in a different decade too. So, they kind of represent different eras in America and different ideas there too. But Night is always the one that stuck with me.
Yeah. All right, so what is that? So now
and Day is fun too. Day gets left out of the conversation, but
now which one is Day now?
So that one, they're stuck in a bunker underneath, like it's a military bunker, and there's some civilians there and some soldiers, and the soldier who runs the place is going totally insane. And there's a scientist down there who is experimenting on the zombies, and he's essentially taught one to.
Oh, so that must have been the 80s.
Remember who he was?
That must have been the 80s one.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's very psychological. There's kind of a little bit of like some Cold War elements to it.
Yeah, because I haven't seen that one.
It's very underrated.
Yeah. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, definitely check it out. The original, not the terrible remake.
Yeah, no. Forget the remakes. We're talking post or pre fucking regurgitation, folks. Where are we at now? So that was your third, or that was your third pick?
That was second.
Oh, second. Okay.
My third is American Werewolf in London.
Oh boy. That's John Landis. John Landis.
Yes, John Landis, and it's a horror movie. It's also a dark comedy with a lot of gallows humor.
Yeah.
It's just what's interesting to me about it is I first discovered it through my mom, who hates horror movies. She can't stand them, and I didn't grow up with them. A lot of kids kind of grew up with like Freddy and Jason and stuff. I didn't watch those movies until I was in college, and not because I was, I was afraid of them or anything like that.
You started earlier.
They didn't interest me. Yeah, It didn't interest me in any way, and I wasn't really into that kind of stuff until later, which then, horror became one of my favorite genres, as obviously you could see with some of my picks here.
Mhm.
But American Werewolf in London, my mom and me used to, when I started to get older, I would stay up late with her and we'd watch like old Monty Python reruns and stuff like that. And that's kind of how we bonded. And
That's number 2 with the Monty Python, the Monty Python bond between parents, and also movie picks based on the bonding with parents. So that's a thread amongst a lot of the guests I have on. At least one film has something to do with a parent and watching it together or being introduced to it by them. Interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, my mom was not a fan of horror movies, but for some reason she really liked this, and I think it's because of the dark humor to it. And obviously, my sense of humor, it came from things like Monty Python. So and they had some darker jokes and some darker sketches and things like that.
Not low hanging
So
fruit.
I was
Stuff you had to think about in order to maybe get or have click.
Yeah, for sure. So we watched that together, and the transformation scene is obviously the thing that sticks out to many people.
Now, so the
and
thing
that
is,
was another thing that blew my mind.
well, so there was 2 going on. There was the Howling, and then there was this transformation in an American Werewolf in Paris. Paris.
London.
Or London was the
Yes,
first one.
Paris was the sequel that
yeah.
they did in the 90s that is
With
awful.
digital effects, which doesn't
It's
compare.
absolutely nothing like this movie at all.
So I'm not sure who the guy was who worked on the transformation, but what happened was he was already slated to do the transformation for John Landis, but then something happened and he ended up working on the Howling. Or he did the Howling transformation, and then John Landis called him and said, "Hey, I have a werewolf transformation I need you for." And he's like, "Oh shit, dude, I just did one for the Howling." And I think he either had somebody else or the same guy, I'm not sure, do the effects. And then the effects for John Landis's film obviously are the gold stone, the gold star, in full light. The Howling was in darkness. Now it was in full light transformation back when they did these things, kids. When you go back and watch it now, even still, that's why CGI sucks. Because there was something physical on screen. Even though you knew it was rubber, you got to see it stretching. And even though you knew there was trickery, it was visceral. They added the sound effects, which they still do, but it was a little different, and it was but that transformation scene, I just wanted to bring that up because the guy I knew there was an issue with the guy who was slated to do that. And I don't know if it was the same guy. I don't know if Rick Baker ended up doing it or who it was, but somebody missed out on
it was Rick Baker who did American Werewolf.
So I have to see if it was Rick Baker, if he did the Howling too, because if that was the case, he did 2 werewolf transformations. He learned his lesson with the Howling and proved it for Werewolf in Paris, London.
Yeah, I enjoy the Howling very much, but American Werewolf I think is just a way better film in a lot of ways, and the transformation scene I think holds up better, like you said, because you can see it in the light, and they had to come up with all these tricks and stuff. I've watched all the behind the scenes stuff, so that's always fascinated me. My father we would used to watch a show called Movie Magic.
Oh my God, Discovery Channel.
And they did back when the Discovery Channel actually had a lot of more interesting programs. They still have some interesting stuff.
Movie Magic was where I learned about the gimbal. Then I was in LA and I was on an elevator on a movie I was working on, and one of the guys, the stunt coordinators, was talking about something, and I was like, "Oh, the gimbal," and he's like, "Did you know my father invented that?" And I was like, I learned about that on Movie Magic on the Discovery Channel. He's like, I'm in the episode. And I was like, oh my God, it blew my mind. I didn't think anyone else on earth knew about it. But Rich, I have to say something for time's sake. We have to get through the rest of your films in like 8 minutes. You know what I'm saying?
I think I can do it. So
okay.
My next pick is Clerks, the original Clerks movie. This one has some signatures on it. I actually have a signed poster from pretty much the whole cast.
No shit.
I have a bunch of signed posters around here. Actually, I have one of Malcolm McDowell on a Clockwork Orange poster as well. But Clerks was a movie that stuck with me, not just because of the cursing, but because obviously
Self-made.
everybody's had those retail jobs, or you should have had a retail job at some point in your life.
Yes.
So you know how to treat other people with respect.
Or you don't.
And so I worked a lot of those types of jobs for a while. So Clerks helped me deal with that. And obviously we made tons of references to Clerks when I was working at Blockbuster.
Yeah.
So that was a movie that always stuck with me, that I enjoyed. And I became a big Kevin Smith fan. And I still love Kevin Smith. He's definitely done some stuff in recent years that maybe I'm not as big on. The new Jay and Silent Bob movie was okay. It didn't, I don't know if he's just there's something missing there.
Once you get the money, sometimes the quality of your work diminishes because you have to pay with more money comes more input, and too many cooks ruin the stew. You know what I'm saying? But continue. This is rapid fire. My first rapid fire. I love Clerks.
All right, so I'll move on quick to my last one. I love silent movies, so I was really, really torn between Metropolis and Nosferatu.
Why not just do both?
They're both incredible films.
Metropolis?
I could probably squeeze both in there.
Talk about movie trickery.
Somebody stole my copy of Nosferatu. They never gave it back, but I have this really cool Nosferatu figure. So I'll hold that up in its place. But I always
deservedly so.
I always loved that. Great movie, visually incredible. Way ahead of its time. It's a weird. It's not
German,
necessarily,
isn't it?
It's German expressionist movie. It's the story of Dracula.
And if you think about German expressionism, just think where Tim Burton may have stolen all of his visuals from. A lot of Tim Burton's visuals
very much so
German expressionism, sort of. So for reference.
Yeah, you look at like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and stuff like that, and you could tell that obviously that was an influence on him for sure. But yeah, Nosferatu was always one that stuck with me, and Metropolis for sure. These again, we talk about special effects, incredibly ahead of its time.
I just watched recently, within the past quarantine period, again a behind the scenes on just. Now, what I think should come back I'm sure they probably do still use matte paintings. I'm sure they still do use matte plates and shots somewhere in the new world, but they need to come back because there's a quality. Anyone who might be a Star Wars fan, I think there's a lot of matte, which is basic. It's hard to explain, but it's a type of special effect that they used for Metropolis. Miniatures need to come back. The art of making miniatures, because there's something about you can see something physically that exists that was filmed on the day in real time versus something, and it has something to do with the lighting that's just not quite perfected. I don't think will ever be perfected well, it will be, but it costs more money to get it to look real. But Metropolis, go back, that's like 1920, it's like earlier. I don't even know, 20 something.
Yeah, I think it's the 20s, maybe early 30s, but yeah, it goes back a long time. And there's a shot with a crowd going through the city, and when you look at how they did that, which obviously those old movies, there's not a lot of behind the scenes stuff because they weren't thinking about DVDs and stuff in those days. But surprisingly, there is footage of it out there, and there's pictures of it and stuff of how they used mirrors to flip the images and then shrink them to the size that they needed to be, and then place them with the matte paintings and everything, and do it all in frame. And it's incredible.
So we don't lose this because those are brilliant things to end on, because it's just brilliant examples of ingenuity and what happens when people don't have all the resources at the click of a button already pre-programmed into an editing software. The what you get from that creatively is, and that's why Metropolis 100 years later is still something gorgeous and beautiful to look at, including Nosferatu.
And what's weird too is that most of Metropolis has been recovered and pieced back together, but there's still small pieces of the movie missing to this
When the fire, wasn't there a fire?
day. So anyone today has never. Well, there was a lot of old copies that were destroyed. In those days, like, you didn't really think to hang on to them.
Right, and you had to read.
So
Celluloid was
there's very
expensive.
few copies out there. And just maybe within the last 10 years, they found another reel that had it's all remastered and stuff. And it's the closest you will ever get. There's a lot of cheap versions. You can watch it for free online. It's in the public domain. But get the Kino version and watch that, where you'll get more of the full picture of what the movie.
So we're going to end this now. Say goodbye. Thank you, Rich Howells, for this.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant picks. Stay safe. Stay safe, world. And buddy, I'll talk to you. Thank you again, Rich.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.